Hello again everyone and welcome back to the Underground. This is the Ukrainian War Intelligence Update for Friday the 18th of February 2022. And it is being recorded the day prior on the 17th. We've got a lot of stuff to talk about today, so let's jump right into the geopolitical update. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about geopolitics because there's just way too much going on. There's a lot of stuff going on out there, and most of it's really not that helpful. So I'm just going to touch on the stuff that is interesting. First up are the nations that have either closed their embassies or moved their embassies to the western parts of Ukraine. The United States has closed their embassy in Kiev and are moving a temporary embassy out west to Lvov. It is unclear as to whether or not that's going to be an operational embassy. I haven't really looked into it that much. But when it comes to Americans in Ukraine, the good news is that Poland is now allowing Americans to cross land borders into Poland without any prior authorization or visas or stuff like that. You can just get all your stuff there right at the border, which is good for those of you who are looking to get out of Ukraine. Speaking of evacuations, we're also seeing an unprecedented number of private jets leaving Ukraine. If you're following a lot of the flight tracker and like open source ADSB trackers, you'll notice that there are an awful lot of private planes leaving Ukraine, one-way trips and going to other countries like Romania, Hungary, places like that. So I thought that's kind of interesting that a lot of the senior economic leaders in the country have left. Actually, Ukraine, the current political leadership had to issue statements urging their people to come back, people who are civil servants to come back to the country. So that's just kind of the way things work out and kind of hints as to what people in very powerful positions are thinking about the potential for invasion. Speaking of air travel, a few airlines, mostly KLM, is the biggest one, have canceled their flights to Ukraine, so they're avoiding all Ukrainian airspace. And this kind of makes sense because Ukraine has a very long history of civilian airliners being shot down during this conflict. Most European, or really every airline, has been avoiding the eastern part of Ukraine for a very long time now because of that. But now it looks like a few airlines are extending that to the entire country. So if you're trying to escape Ukraine, if you're trying to leave, airline travel might not be, just like what we've been saying, is airline travel might not be that reliable. Something also of note in Russia is, or really rather disputed territory, is the American submarine incident between the United States and Russia. So a lot of people aren't aware of what went on with this, and we still really don't know the full story. Really all we're getting is Russia's side of the story. But the short version of this is that the Russian Navy detected and intercepted an American Virginia-class submarine operating in their territorial waters off the Kuril Islands. This was a few days ago. The Russians claim that they have used kinetic measures to encourage the United States submarine to leave their waters, and the U.S. submarine left at high speed. Now, if this sounds a little fishy, that's probably because it is. There's a lot of things wrong with the Russian version of the story. For one, the Virginia-class submarines are very hard to detect, and the vessels that were in the area that Russia claims detected the submarine, that's going to be a hard task for those ancient vessels. So there's that. I don't doubt for 1 minute that the United States does not have submarines shadowing the exercises off the Kuril Islands, the Russian naval exercises, but it just doesn't sound right. The U.S. Navy has, of course, denied the entire thing, and Russia has refused to give any kind of proof as to knocking the American submarine out of their waters or something like that. The reason I'm having a hard time defining it is because Russia's used very shady language. They've said they used special means to get the United States submarine to leave. I don't know what that means. It can be anything. There's a lot of different things that go on in the subworld diplomatically. So it could be everything from some kind of special acoustic measure or even some kind of kinetic measure to warn the U.S. submarine off. But again, they're being very vague about it, and it sounds a lot like Russian propaganda at this point. And really, the kind of nail in the coffin for this is this image, which has been circulating around a lot of Russian language chats and a lot of Russian media, claiming that this is an American countermeasure, an acoustics countermeasure for an American submarine, as in the Russians scared the American submarine and they deployed acoustic countermeasures to escape and distract and cover their retreat. And here's proof, right? Well, here's the problem. This is actually not American. This is a Russian anti-submarine or submarine countermeasure system. This is a very actually this image pulled up on the internet quite a long time ago, and it's very interesting because it's kind of a classified system for the Russians. So this torpedo-like system is really an electronic countermeasure, right? It's an acoustic countermeasure system that can deploy other countermeasures. At least we think. In the subworld, these are not particularly new. They've been around for a while, but they're new to most people, I think. But the interesting part is that this image of one kind of washing up on the shore there is Russian. It was due to their Russians testing on their own systems, and yet a lot of Russian language platforms are claiming that this is American. So kind of interesting and kind of the nail in the coffin that proves that probably didn't occur. Did a Russian surface vessel or other submarine detect an American submarine? Yeah, probably. Maybe. Who knows? It's literally impossible to know. Submarine diplomacy is one of those things where you're never really going to know what actually happened until probably 40 years later. But it was kind of interesting, so I wanted to mention it. Also, Russia has got an exercise coming up, which is kind of a regular exercise for them that most people call the GROM exercise. It's basically their exercise for World War III. It's to test their nuclear triad and the communication systems between their submarines, their bombers, and their land-based systems. So a lot of people are thinking that this Russian nuclear-style exercise is really a way to deter NATO from doing very much when Russia invades Ukraine. So Ukraine gets invaded by Russia. NATO gets a little squirrely. Russia uses this exercise as a way to kind of dominate or try to encourage NATO to not do very much. So I thought I'd point that out because it's kind of an important thing. Moving on to our naval update, don't really have much for the GA-UK gap or the North Sea, so I'm just going to skip right to the Med, where there's a lot of activity. Now, this slide is outdated. We've been updating the slides in between briefings. As some of you probably know, I've been uploading these slides as regularly as we can between the videos that come out, and this has changed quite a bit. So at the time we made this slide, there were a grand total of 12 Russian landing craft or landing ships underway in the Black Sea. A few of them have come back, and a few of them have gone back out again, so we're still counting to figure out who's where. But roughly speaking, there's still a lot of activity going on in the Black Sea, as well as the Med. There's been a lot of activity. It's really hard to kind of track where these vessels are at because usually by the time that we get either a satellite image of where they're at or an AIS ping of where they're at, they've already moved. So that's just something to keep in mind. But right now in the Med and in the Black Sea, there is a lot of steel in the water. Moving to the overall update for Ukraine, we've kind of had to simplify this graphic a little bit. It's still not perfect. Of course, it's very far from perfect, but I just wanted to show you the major units that are here in theater because this is going to be a high-level map. We just have too many icons at this point. So let's go ahead and jump to the actual fronts. On the Northeastern Front, this is where we're seeing most activity as of the past 48 hours. That's why we've drawn a little flet there, a little frontline enemy troops, just so people understand what's more likely to occur. Right over the border, just on the other side of the border of Kharkiv in Russia, we're seeing a lot of units move to what we think are their final staging positions. This is something that the U.S. government has also backed up if you trust them, which you shouldn't, honestly, but even OSINT trackers on Twitter can show you pictures of these units moving to their final staging locations. We're seeing units move really, really close to the border in this particular area. So this is kind of the highest tension part of the entire Ukrainian border at this time, but we have other things to mention as well. So let's jump a little bit closer into the Kharkiv front and see what's going on. So like I mentioned, we're seeing a lot of units being staged in Belgorod and then moving out from Belgorod to other further locations closer to the Ukrainian border, such as Sirotino, Veselaya, Lopan, and the Shebekino Depot. These are basically just fields, little either defunct old Soviet bases that they're revitalizing or places like that. We can get more into the specifics of some of these as time goes on. But I also wanted to point out that in Belgorod, we're starting to see a lot of the TOS-1s, MLRSs move into the area as well. Now, these are some nasty weapons. I wanted to point that out because it's an interesting concept that not a lot of people think about. And these are like your standard MLRS, but the warheads that they're being used, that these systems use, are they have the capability for using newer thermobaric types of weapons. Basically, it's very comparable to our HIMARS system here we have in the U.S., the grid square eraser, right? But this does it with thermobaric weapons, and that's just really, really nasty. The reason that I want to mention this specifically is because we saw during the battle for the Donetsk airport a lot of Ukrainians claiming that thermobaric weapons were used against them, and that these specific weapons were used against them. And there wasn't a whole lot of conclusiveness to that. I would say it's pretty conclusive based on the pictures of the bodies. It's something that you really don't want to talk about at the dinner table, to be honest. But the international community was like, I don't really know. Well, now we're seeing these units being kind of openly transported, not even, being covered, whereas the first time they were allegedly used, it was very secret. So now we know that not only do these units exist, but they also exist in this theater, and they also exist with the kinds of weapons that we think they have. So, again, confidence level in this is, moderate, I guess. But we've seen these on trains being unloaded from Belgorod, so, take it for what it's worth, I guess. So jumping into a couple of specific locations, I wanted to talk about Belgorod FARP for a second. This is an interesting one because this is a jump FARP, a forward arming and refueling point for helicopters. This points to Russia's recent, I shouldn't say doctrinal change, but it's just kind of what they do now, which is rely heavily on helicopters for movement. And this is a perfect location for it. It's only 36K from the Ukrainian border. It's a nice, safe area. This is an old Cold War base that's just kind of in the middle of nowhere. Even though it's on the outskirts of Belgorod there, it's still really a remote location. But that's what they're using this location to stage a lot of their helicopters. So similar situation over here in Veselaya, Lopan. This is just a normal civilian town. Interestingly enough, when the Russians got here, they weren't actually using the camp that's to the northwest of town. They were actually staging their T-80s and different kinds of IFVs like BMPs and such along the railway. So civilians were able to get really close to these parked vehicles and get a lot of good pictures of them. So something very interesting, but now we're mostly seeing them staged just to the northwest of town there. Just wanted to mention this because, again, we found out about this camp, and really the OSINT community found out about this camp right as Russia was claiming that they were pulling back, and we're seeing, videos on Twitter of tanks being offloaded quite clearly and then sent to this camp here. Moving out east, we've actually seen a little bit of an increase in conflict along the Eastern Front. Now, when it comes to the actual conflict, it's hard to say where the conflict has occurred. There have been a lot of ceasefire violations over the past few days, but the international monitoring group for the ceasefire has actually started to pull out of this area. So they're getting ready to evacuate. So it's really hard to say how effective the international monitors are at checking out the conflict in eastern Ukraine. So they haven't said that they've fully left yet, but it's kind of obvious that everybody in eastern Ukraine is thinking about leaving. So I guess we'll have to see how effective they are at monitoring the conflict over the next few days. Also, diplomatically, we're seeing a lot of things being claimed by the Russians that I'm not quite certain how to think about just yet. For instance, the Russians are claiming that they have discovered a lot of mass graves in eastern Ukraine, and as such, a lot of Western analysts are thinking, this is Russia's excuse to invade, to stop the genocide, right? Because Putin himself has used the word genocide a lot to describe what's going on in eastern Ukraine. Never mind that it actually has been the Russians shelling civilians this entire time. But anyway, just wanted to point that out, that we are aware of the rhetoric and the language that's being used. It's just really hard for us to kind of narrow that down at this time and say that we know definitively what the true story is. Along the southern front, like I mentioned, lots of vessels out in the water. There have been a lot of aircraft being staged in the Crimean Peninsula as well, mostly at defunct Air Force bases. We've got over 70 helicopters at one old school Soviet base. So yeah, again, Southern Front looks like it's preparing. Now, again, I should mention that the Russians have put out statements saying, look, we're withdrawing from our positions. We're leaving. We're coming back. They're sending troops back. And they publish videos of trains loaded with equipment and soldiers being moved back east across the Crimean Bridge. Here's the problem with that, though. A lot of those units, they're actually closer to Ukraine's border. When they go home to their home units, they just move right around to the Eastern Front. They're closer to Ukraine when they go home than they are in Crimea, which is interesting. Also, we're seeing a lot of those units that Russia has in their own videos popping up closer to the border, again, either to the north or to the east. So again, it's really hard to say what's going on, but it sounds to me like there is a lot of Russian gaslighting going on when it comes to, yeah, we're pulling our forces back, when we can clearly see ourselves that that's not the case. And that's completely irrelevant of any American rhetoric on this. Like, I can download the satellite images and I can go on Twitter and count tanks just as well as anybody else can. And I can myself can see that the Russians aren't pulling out anybody just yet. On to the Western Front, really not a whole lot going on other than the United States issuing do not travel orders for Transnistria and Moldova. And beginning like sort of evacuation processes for those countries as well. But I'm not really sure how significant that is, other than maybe a push for Odessa if it comes to that. Like I mentioned, the reason that we're talking about this front is because it's important, especially for Odessa. So we'll definitely keep an eye on it, but there's really not a whole lot going on there at the moment. Moving to the Northwestern Front, we have a lot of activity here as well, and a very interesting story that has unfolded over the past few days. So let's dive in a little closer. First up, I wanted to talk a little bit about Belgorod camp from last time, just to show you some updates to it. So here's the overall satellite image. Here's the image we showed last time, and here is imagery as of the 9th, showing that vehicles have moved. This is something that we expected as soon as we dropped the video on it and as soon as other OSINT entities became aware of this location. It's not particularly new. These guys have been there for a very long time, but again, just because we're talking about it in a video does not mean that we just discovered it. These guys have been there for quite a while. So I don't want to say that Russia moved these assets due to we here, exposing their position, but that would also not surprise me. So to those out there in the intel or operations world, don't think that we're naive in this regard. We are fully aware of who's reading these products. I just wanted to point out that we here are thinking about these things and being as considerate as possible towards the planning efforts of those who are better suited to doing good than we can. If nothing else, a little healthy competition coming from ourselves, an agency in the open source world with almost no resources, can encourage the U.S. intelligence community to up their game. After all, no commander wants to see that some guy on YouTube with an internet connection has better intelligence than their active duty S2 shop. That's the way it should be. I wouldn't want that either. OSINT is a tool in the toolbox, not the entire toolbox. So if our work can encourage our active duty counterparts to be better instead of stealing paragraphs for a Grintsum that nobody will read or sitting on Merc chat all day long with a bag of Cheetos, that's a good thing in our book. And now moving to a big bit of news that has been taking the OSINT world and the journalistic world by storm for the past couple of days. That is this pontoon bridge that has been set up in Belarus. Now, for those of you that keep up with OSINT and know what has happened to this bridge, hang on for just a minute. And let's take a look at the overall area of this bridge, because this really doesn't show us that much. Moving out, we can see the Ukrainian border up there, the Chernobyl exclusion zone there in orange, and the pontoon bridge itself. As you can see, it is very close to the border. It is 6 kilometers as the crow flies to the border there, within the Belarusian side of the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And as we can see, it's very close to Kiev as well. So let's jump out of the satellite image and go to a street map image so that we can talk a little bit more about this location. One of the reasons that the world is all abuzz about this bridge is that it's kind of a big deal with regards to wet gap crossings. In other words, militaries have to cross bodies of water, and pontoon bridges are the way to do that. And if you put a pontoon bridge here, it looks an awful lot like you're trying to move forces or enable the freedom of movement for forces really close to the border. Because the next bridge that can be used by armored vehicles to actually cross the Pripyat River is all the way north in Missouri. So as the crow flies, that's 66 kilometers. So one might think that, hey, if troops are trying to move in this direction, they're going to need to cross this bridge, and then they can punch right through across the border into the exclusion zone. Very good way for troops to move around. Otherwise, they would have to go all the way over here to Missouri and then head south, right? So that's why people are thinking about this as like, holy cow, this is like the smoking gun when it comes to Russia trying to invade Ukraine. This is like the most important news ever, right? Well, not really. For one, the biggest bit of evidence kind of against this pontoon bridge being any kind of use whatsoever is that Russia is already on the other side of the river. That's where these units are right now. That's exactly what they did. They went to Missouri, they crossed over, and now they're right there in Yeltsk, right across the border. So they're kind of already on the other side of the river. Another bit of information is that when you look at a map like this, you tend to forget something, and that is what the weather's like. So let's zoom in a little bit and take a look at some recent Sentinel imagery. Here's where the pontoon bridge is, and here's the rest of the Pripyat River. It's kind of frozen. Now granted, the ice in the Pripyat River might not be thick enough to drive a tank over. You need many inches of ice for a tank to be able to drive across it, right? And the thinning patches of ice that we see up to the northern parts of the Pripyat River, that kind of indicates this. It's probably not thick enough for a tank to drive across. But I also find it pretty hard to believe that the Russians wouldn't be able to find a better spot to cross. They clearly chose this spot because of the open water for a reason. So taking all of this into account and just kind of absorbing all of the information that's out there about this pontoon bridge, we come to a few different conclusions, or really a few different explanations for why this bridge can be there. The first of which is the one that everybody's saying, which is that this bridge is a legitimate attempt for Russia to be able to increase their freedom of maneuver right next to the border so that they can strike fast and strike hard, right? Even though they can use the bridge up in Missouri, it's probably a little bit easier to have a bridge a little bit closer down to the border if they're trying to invade somebody. Again, I don't think this is likely. I think this is extremely unlikely knowing what we know now, but I'll get to that in a minute. The other immediate thought that comes to mind is that this is something shiny for the Americans to look at, right? It's a distraction, in other words. It's something for Ukraine to get all upset about because it's 6 kilometers from their border. That should be a hint in and of itself, because you don't want to build something that close to the border when even light artillery can take it out, right? So the fact that it's so close to the Ukrainian border presents a risk, so something to think about, right? Another big hint. But again, this could purely be a distraction with no intention of Russia using it whatsoever. But really what I think is most likely is that this bridge serves multiple roles. For one, Russia benefits by keeping tensions high right now, right? They look like they're the ones who are in the right and the West is in the wrong. They're able to keep their propaganda machine going in overdrive. It keeps the morale for troops high. And it, again, allows the Americans to be embarrassed once again. Russia, time after time, even just over the past couple of weeks, Russia's actions have been very good at getting the West to react to them. When in actuality, Russia's just sitting back and letting the West, make fools of itself again. Russia has gotten really good at gaslighting the United States, for one, but also making Western leadership look like fools through their own actions. Russia's really good at pinpointing something and then doing something to make the West react, and then the West looks like an idiot. So this is a good way to do that. A pontoon bridge is pretty cheap to install, it's very easy to do, and it's very, very public. And it's also good legitimate practice because, let's face it, Russia's going to have a lot of wet gap crossings in Ukraine if they choose to invade. So you've got the Dnieper River, you've got a lot of other smaller bodies of water that still require, engineers to get across. So this is a good way to practice for that. And like I mentioned earlier, right when we started talking about this bridge, there's more to the story. As of this morning, the bridge is gone. We can tell this via Sentinel imagery that was downloaded as of last night, and the bridge has now been relocated. So, that's that, I guess. This whole exercise in talking about the bridge really isn't about the bridge. It's really to show that even though the Intel Handbook indicates X, some common sense is also required. Just like the US government and governments around the world were dead set on telling the world that Russia is going to invade on the 16th of February. And since it's now the 17th, or 18th when this video goes out, and no invasion occurred, the US Intel community looks foolish. And speaking of that date, a lot of people have been asking, well, how did the U.S. government know with such certainty that Russia had planned the invasion for the 16th? And why would they say this openly? Well, the reason for saying it openly is quasi-legitimate, I suppose. If you say, hey, if you have unrefuted, undoubtable proof that Russia is going to invade on the 16th, and you tell the world this, well, obviously Russia is not going to invade on the 16th. They're going to not invade on the 16th because you've discovered their plans and now they have to change their plans, or they were never planning on invading on the 16th and now you just look like a fool. In any case, we will never know what intelligence the U.S. government had to indicate with such certainty that Russia was going to invade on the 16th. It's a win-win for both, because now the Biden regime gets to claim that, we stopped them invading on the 16th, and Russia gets to claim, well, the U.S. looks like fools because they said we were going to invade on the 16th, and we never invaded on the 16th. So it's a win for both sides, which is why you don't really hear too much about it. Based on my own speculation, I think I know how they got that date. If they didn't have any really concrete proof, it's pretty easy to come up with the 16th as a date. And this is just my own personal guess, right? So my guess is that they either had some kind of comment, some kind of communications interception, or some kind of document, right? Some top secret document from the Kremlin that indicated that date. Plus, the 16th was during a green illumination cycle. In other words, the moon was very bright and therefore more conducive to nighttime airborne operations, which is what Russia would use, right? Which, as a side note, is why we talk about this stuff, because lunar illumination is important for things like this. But it's not the only factor, right? And at the same time, I can look at that assessment of the 16th and know that it was made by a junior analyst or somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. In other words, if I were back at the Intel schoolhouse and I had a class of soon-to-be analysts in my classroom and I were to ask them to assess what date Russia would choose to invade, I would expect every one of them to say the 16th. That's just what you come up with if you're a junior analyst. That's the textbook answer. And it's not a wrong answer, right? If you're a junior analyst, that's what I would expect. And you use the Intel cycle, you process information, and you come up with the 16th as a date. It's not textbook wrong, it's just that if you know more about the situation, you're not going to come up with that date. Unfortunately, in today's Intel community, most analysts are incapable of giving anything other than the textbook answer. Either way, this is all just a gut feeling on my part, and I think I've beat this horse enough. I just thought that this was a fascinating illustration of so many different ideas that it was worth sharing, because this bridge has become more of a proverbial wooden horse than a wooden bridge. It is a great example of analysis gone awry, and how it's good to think for yourself. And really, it's an allegory of the deception that's taking place everywhere with regards to Ukraine right now. When this bridge first became public, it swept through the OSINT community like wildfire. As it should. This is important stuff, right? Wet gap crossings and pontoon bridges in this context are something that should grab one's attention. But it shouldn't consume one's entire attention span. We shouldn't be scurrying from event to event, just like the Russians and the American defense industry want us to. We need to see the whole picture. But we also shouldn't ignore the indicators of an invasion. Keeping calm and keeping a cool head is very hard to do, especially when you have so many intel gaps. There's so much that you don't know, but it's still important to do. The world isn't going to end because you waited a day to form an opinion on something, and it's always better for analysts to be unconventional in their thinking. And speaking of invasion potential and looking at the whole picture, right? The team here found an interesting article that comes from a Ukrainian think tank, which outlines a few critical points that argue against the possibility of an invasion. They think it's not likely. With everyone arguing about the will they, won't they nature of the Russians invading, I wanted to offer at least one legitimate counterpoint to our opinion that the invasion is imminent. Right now, opinions regarding Russia invading are mostly coming from a perspective of American domestic politics. A lot of people are rushing to fill the opposite space of whatever their political opponents are saying. So the Biden regime comes out and says Russia's going to invade. The people who are opposite to the Biden administration come out and say Russia's not going to invade. So they only want to have that opposition. They don't want to actually look at the situation on the ground and the situation in the world. They just want to be the opposite of whatever their enemies are. And sometimes that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if you shove America's domestic situation and the military-industrial complex aside, we can clearly see Russia's actions as inflammatory. This paper, which I would encourage you to read, the link of which will be in the description, of course, and on the sources slide for this, goes into detail on why they think Russia won't be invading in any significant way. So rather than highlight their points for them, I'll let you read through them on your own, but I would like to address some of the ideas that they had. First up is the potential for a large-scale combat operation, or LSCO, also known as World War III, at least in this context, right? So is Russia prepared to launch a large-scale combat operation? I don't think so. But like we mentioned in an earlier brief, Russia has left her own territory laughably vulnerable to pretty much anyone who wants to strike her. All of the units that have been deployed by Russia have been either meant for a conflict in Ukraine or as a deterrence for NATO. In other words, if Russia was preparing for a knockdown, drag-out fight, they're doing it all wrong because they haven't deployed nearly enough troops. But is it enough to handle Ukraine? Absolutely, I think so. I think Russia's choice in style of warfare, from everything from unit composition to their diplomacy, is the perfect choice for going into combat for Ukraine. If I myself were planning an invasion of Ukraine, I would do exactly what Russia has done so far. Now, the other point that the paper makes is meant to address the follow-on question that people have. Right now, people are asking, okay, Russia's going to invade, like that seems pretty clear at this point, but how far will they go? I, like anyone else, don't know the answer to that question, but my guess is that Russia probably will not go whole hog and launch a total invasion without any concerns for NATO. My guess is they won't do that. But I also think that based on the units we've seen maneuvering, they won't exactly go for a minor incursion either. A byproduct of the world's eyes on Ukraine right now is that Russia will not be able to use their little green men or separatists at all this time, right? With everyone all hyped up and watching, this is going to reduce a big advantage that the Russians love to use: secrecy. That might be enough to deter them, or it might not. What do I think they're going to do? I think they're going to invade. How far will they go? I don't know. What limitations will they place on themselves to keep tensions with NATO as low as possible while still meeting their objectives in Ukraine? I don't know that either. How long does Russia plan for it to take to reach their objectives? I don't know, but based on their logistics, or lack thereof, probably not very long. I think what would be interesting is for Russia to do a sort of double bluff and pretend to draw back forces, or just leave them forward deployed for a few months until nobody cares anymore, and then use the slow approach like they did in 2014 when they were more or less able to operate in the shadows and the world didn't care. That would be pretty slick. It would make the US leadership look foolish for all their recent sky is falling rhetoric, and it would leave Russia in a better spot for an invasion later in the year. Of course, I'll be the first one to admit that as an analyst, one has a very strong urge to put caveats on things. Every analyst has an escape sentence in every assessment, just so that in the event that they're wrong, they don't look like a complete idiot. And I'm not perfect, I do that too. I try not to do that so much because I think it's cheap and dirty. And I think that analysts being afraid of being wrong is why the intel community sucks so bad, and why bad analysts or yes men keep getting promoted. But I would also have to argue that, man, if this all turns out to be a massive military deception campaign on Russia's part, they certainly fooled me. And here's what they did to fool me. Russia deployed more people and equipment to their borders than have ever been deployed since World War II, and they spent millions of dollars and countless resources doing it. They deployed most of their naval forces for no reason and moved vessels around the planet, all the way from the Arctic and from the Pacific, just to fool us. They established forward positions and hidden staging areas on their borders that we didn't know about, letting us see where Russia would deploy if an invasion were to occur for real. In other words, if Russia did this massive deployment, just to test NATO's responses and get NATO to reveal their wartime tactics, well, NATO certainly learned vastly more about Russia than Russia learned about NATO. These actions on Russia's part are why I think Russia is going to invade. If we were to flip through the checklists of what Russia would have to do to invade Ukraine, almost every box has been checked. There are only a couple of criteria that haven't really been satisfactorily met, and the weather isn't super great, nor are there logistics, thus the uncertainty. But right now, I would, and am, making decisions based off of Russia invading Ukraine, and whatever effects that might have on us here at home, in addition to being a vital look into what a modern large-scale war might look like. We do not often get chances like this to learn without experiencing casualties of our own. And since Ukraine is about to pay the price, the least we can do is remember and learn the lessons that have been learned the hard way by others. At this stage, Russia has a lot to lose if they don't invade. There are a few things that Russia gets out of this deployment so far, like embarrassing NATO and the knowledge that NATO will back down in the face of Russian aggression. That's quite clear. I think that was clear before this whole Ukrainian situation launched. I think it was clear in 2014 when the Ukrainian conflict sort of kicked off in earnest. But if Russia doesn't invade, look what she will have gotten. She will have strengthened NATO presence in Eastern Europe, along a whole host of other things, right? We're talking new alliances forming, more equipment flowing into Ukraine, and NATO being more likely to accept Ukraine into their membership. So regardless of whatever U.S. politicians or defense industry executives are saying about this, this is really it. Russia has a lot to lose if they don't invade at this point. They have a lot to lose and very, very little to gain, unless there is some other kind of secret objective that Russia is trying to go for, and something that I don't understand, right? Of course, nobody's perfect, and I might be a total idiot on this. I might be missing something completely huge, right? But I just can't see at this point what Russia would have to gain other than some very minor things if they don't invade. And before we closed out for today, I just wanted to remind everyone that there's a lot happening around the world. In fact, it's maddening to try to keep up with it all. Keeping an eye on what's going on in Europe is important, because it affects us here at home. But so is keeping an eye on what's happening here in the U.S. or with our brothers and sisters to the north. So do not think that we are neglecting our own backyard at the expense of talking about Ukraine, because it's interesting. We are certainly watching what's going on in Canada as well, because very few people are talking about what's going on in Canada and the implications that this has on our entire Western civilization. And we're going to be talking a lot about that in the next brief as well, the next non-Ukraine brief. So I just want to let everybody know we're watching this stuff, and we're trying to figure out what this stuff means for all of us here at home as well. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks for your support, and remember to not let this stuff stress you out too much. It's pretty easy to be overwhelmed with a lot of this stuff that's going on these days, so taking some time to unplug and unwind is just as important as being informed. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.